Harold Blackwood slammed the papers down on the kitchen table so hard that the oil lamp jumped. "Sign it," he said, "or I take the land, all of it, tonight." Abigail Miller didn't move. She stood at the far end of the table, hands pressed flat against the wood, looking at the man who had just told her father that the price of their family's debt was her body, her name, her entire future, handed over like a piece of livestock at auction. Her father didn't say a word. That silence was the moment everything changed. Not the threat, not the papers. The silence from the one man in the world who was supposed to protect her. If that were you, if the person who raised you simply looked away, what would you do? Before we go any further, if stories like this move you, if you believe a woman's worth is never determined by the people who failed to see it, please subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell. Every week we bring you stories of ordinary people who refuse to stay invisible. Drop a comment and tell us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it touches your heart, leave a like. It costs nothing and means everything. Now, let's go back to Harlan Creek, Montana, 1887, and the night Abigail Miller decided she was done being invisible. The autumn of 1887 came to Harlan Creek the way bad news always did. Quietly at first, then all at once. The grass died before it was supposed to. The creek that gave the town its name ran thin and brown and barely moved. 3 families had already packed their wagons and left without saying goodbye to anyone, because there was no one left to say goodbye to. The town had that particular kind of emptiness that settles in when people stop believing things will get better, but haven't yet admitted it to themselves. The Miller Ranch sat at the eastern edge of town, far enough from the main road that strangers rarely came down it by accident. It was a working ranch in the way that a man with a broken leg is still technically a man. It functioned, barely, through sheer stubbornness and not much else. The fence posts needed replacing. The barn roof had been patched so many times the patches themselves had begun to rot. The horses were lean. The cattle were fewer than they'd been the year before, and fewer still than the year before that. But every morning, before the sun had fully cleared the hills, a lamp came on in the farmhouse kitchen. That was Abigail. She was 28 years old that autumn, and she had the kind of face that people describe by saying what it wasn't. She wasn't pretty in the way that turned heads in town. She wasn't tall or graceful or fashionable. She wore her dark hair pinned back without ceremony, and her dresses were clean but plain, and she moved through the world with the particular efficiency of a person who has learned that pausing too long in one place invites comment. She had 2 older brothers, Douglas and Frank, who were louder than her, took up more space, and somehow always managed to be somewhere else when the actual work needed doing. Her father, Jonas Miller, was a man who had once been capable and proud, and had slowly, over the course of 15 years, become someone who talked more about what he used to do than what he was doing now. Her mother had died when Abigail was 12, and in the years that followed, the ranch had reorganized itself around Abigail the way water reorganizes itself around whatever rock you drop into it. The rock doesn't plan it, the water just has nowhere else to go. She kept the accounts. She ordered the feed. She managed the seasonal hands when they could afford any, and when they couldn't, she did the work herself and didn't complain about it because complaining would have required someone to listen. The town of Harlan Creek had a name for women like Abigail Miller, though they never said it to her face. Spinster, workhorse, poor thing. She had heard all 3 at one point or another, usually whispered behind her while she was standing at the dry goods counter in McKinnon's store, pretending to examine bolts of fabric she couldn't afford to buy. The worst part wasn't the whispers. The worst part was that after enough years she had stopped being surprised by them. It was a Tuesday in late September when the man who called himself Luke Harper arrived at the Miller Ranch. He came on foot, which was unusual. Most men looking for seasonal work rode in on something, even if it was a horse that had seen better decades. This man carried a worn canvas pack over one shoulder and wore boots that were scuffed down to practically nothing at the toes. His jacket was faded and too light for the season. He had dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that needed shaving and the kind of careful eyes that notice things without making it obvious they were noticing. Abigail was mending a section of fence along the north pasture when she saw him coming up the road. She kept her hands moving on the wire while she watched him, because she had learned a long time ago that looking too directly at a situation sometimes caused it to change before you understood it. "Ma'am," he said when he reached her. He didn't offer a hand because she was still holding wire cutters. "I heard in town you might be taking on help for the autumn work. I'm looking for a position. Day wages are fine, or room and board if that works better." His voice was steady, not nervous, not performing, just even. Abigail looked at him properly then. "Who told you in town?" "Man at the livery stable. Said Miller Ranch might have use for an extra hand." She thought about that. Clarence at the livery was not in the habit of sending work to her. He usually sent men to her brothers, who were more visible and more social, and more likely to buy Clarence a drink in return for the favor. "You done ranch work before?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." "Where?" "Wyoming, mostly. A stretch in Colorado." She waited for him to say more. Men usually filled silences with additional information about themselves, true or not. This one didn't. He just stood there, hands easy at his sides, letting her think. That, more than anything else, made her cautious. "I'd need to speak to my father," she said. "Of course." She walked him up to the house to go out. Bien. Jonas Miller was sitting on the porch when they arrived, which was where he spent most of his mornings since his back had gotten bad the previous winter. He looked Luke Harper over with the slow assessment of a man who had once known what to look for in ranch hands, but was now slightly out of practice. "You can lift?" Jonas asked. "Yes, sir." "You steal?" "No, sir." Jonas glanced at Abigail, who gave a small shrug that communicated nothing in particular. He turned back to Luke Harper. "We pay $2 a day. There's a bunk in the barn." "That's fair," Luke said. And that was how Ethan Carter, the sole owner of Carter Ridge Ranch, one of the 3 largest cattle operations in all of Montana, a man whose accounts held more money than most Harlan Creek residents would earn in 5 combined lifetimes, became Luke Harper, seasonal hand on a failing ranch, sleeping on a cot in a barn that smelled like old hay and rust. He had planned it for months. The idea had come to him after a woman named Charlotte Haynes, whom he had been courting seriously for the better part of a year, had let something slip at dinner one evening. She had been talking to his ranch foreman, a man named Bud Owens, and she didn't know Ethan was within earshot when she said it. Quiet, almost offhand, the way people say the things they actually mean. "The land is beautiful, isn't it? A woman could do a lot with land like this." Not, "A woman could build something here." Not, "I could be happy here with him." A woman could do a lot with land like this. Ethan had stood in the doorway of his own dining room and felt something cold and precise settle into his chest, like the moment you realize the pain you've been ignoring for weeks is actually something serious. He had ended the relationship the following morning, politely, firmly, with no room for negotiation. Charlotte had been confused, then furious, then calculating. She'd actually asked, before she left, whether there was any arrangement they could come to regardless of their personal situation. She meant the land. She meant his money. She was talking about his money to his face while pretending she was talking about him. He rode out to the north edge of his property that afternoon and sat on his horse for a long time, looking at the mountains. He was 34 years old. He had built something real, something that took actual work and actual intelligence to build. He had also apparently built a very reliable way of attracting people who wanted the thing, rather than the person who made the thing. And he had no idea, genuinely no idea, whether he was capable of recognizing the difference anymore. The idea came to him the way bad ideas often do, slowly and then with conviction. He would go somewhere he wasn't known. He would take nothing with him that signaled who he was. He would work, actually work, with his hands the way he had when he was 19 and starting out. And he would see, in the plainest possible terms, how people treated a man who had nothing to offer them. He told Bud Owens he was taking a personal leave. Bud was used to Ethan's private nature and didn't press him. He packed light. He rode to the next county before he even began looking for somewhere to land. The man at the livery stable in Harlan Creek mentioned the Miller Ranch without any particular enthusiasm. "They're struggling," Clarence had said. "Might be grateful for the help." Ethan had walked the rest of the way. Bossette. He had expected the work to be hard. It was. He had not expected how much that would feel like relief. There is something clarifying about labor that has immediate physical results. A fence post either goes in straight or it doesn't. A calf either gets up on its legs or it needs more attention. There is no pretending, no managing of appearances, no delicate social navigation of who thinks what about whom. The work just is, and either you can do it or you can't, and nobody cares where you went to school or how much your operation is worth. For the first 3 days, he mostly worked alongside Douglas and Frank Miller, Abigail's brothers, both of whom were affable and loud and good company in the way that people who don't carry much weight tend to be good company. They told jokes, they complained cheerfully about the weather, they knocked off early in the afternoon and headed into town most evenings and came back late. Abigail was almost never in the same place they were. He noticed her work before he noticed her, in the sense that he kept arriving at tasks that someone had already half completed. A feed line that had been patched, a water trough that had been cleaned, a section of accounting papers on the kitchen table, left out when she hadn't had time to put them away before starting the next thing, and he'd glanced at them once, not to pry, just reflexively, and seen that her numbers were meticulous. She tracked things down to the cent. On the 4th morning, he found her in the pasture before dawn, sitting on her heels in the dirt next to a heifer that had been running a fever for 2 days. He stopped at a respectful distance. "She any better?" Abigail didn't look up. "A little. Fever broke around midnight." "You were out here at midnight." Who else was going to be? It wasn't a question. He recognized the tone. Not bitter exactly, not even resigned, just factual. The tone of a person who has made their peace with the arithmetic. He crouched down on the other side of the heifer. "What'd you use?" She told him. It was the right treatment, done at the right time, probably saving an animal that was worth more than the ranch could afford to lose. He didn't say any of that because it would have sounded like flattery, and he suspected she had a finely tuned aversion to flattery from people who didn't know her. They sat there in the pre-dawn dark while the heifer breathed and the sky started to go from black to a thin, cold purple, and neither of them said anything for a while, and it was the most comfortable silence Ethan had spent in recent memory. He began to see the shape of her life more clearly over the following week. She woke earlier than anyone. She worked later. She made decisions, real operational decisions about the ranch, about buying and selling, about which animals to keep and which to let go, and then watched those decisions get credited to her father or seconded by her brothers as if they had thought of them first. Jonas Miller wasn't cruel about it. He was simply incapable, on some deep structural level, of seeing his daughter as the source of things, rather than just the person who made things happen. "Abigail'll handle it," was something he heard Jonas say at least twice a day, always followed by Jonas wandering off to deal with whatever easier thing demanded his attention. She handled it. She always handled it, and nobody, not once in the time Ethan watched, said thank you. He almost said something to her about it one evening when they were both working late in the barn, but he stopped himself because he understood instinctively that she would hate the pity in it. She didn't need someone to feel sorry for her. She knew her situation. She had assessed it the same careful way she assessed everything else, and she had made her decisions about it, and she was living inside those decisions with a kind of stubborn dignity that he found, quietly and without quite meaning to, remarkable. There was a night, about 2 weeks in, when Douglas had too much to drink and said something at the dinner table that was ugly even by the low bar of drunk brothers, something about how Abigail could barely manage to keep herself decent, let alone run a ranch. And Abigail went very still for a moment, the way a person goes still when they've heard a version of something so many times that they've learned to wait it out. Then she set down her fork, folded her napkin, stood up and said very quietly, "Supper's done," and walked out of the room. She didn't cry. She didn't slam the door. She just left, with what was left of her dignity gathered around her like a coat. Ethan sat at the table for another 2 minutes, mainly to keep himself from saying something that would end his employment, and then excused himself and went back to the barn. He lay on his cot staring at the dark roof and thought, this woman has been surviving her own family her whole life. The thought sat on him like weight. But 3 weeks into his time at the Miller Ranch, Harold Blackwood came to call. Ethan heard the arrival from the barn. A good horse, well-shod, expensive tack, the particular way a wealthy man moves when he's accustomed to other people getting out of his way. He looked through a gap in the barn wall and saw a broad, well-dressed man in his late 50s dismounting in the yard. Silver hair, close-cut beard, the smile of a person who finds himself charming. He stayed where he was. This wasn't his business. It became his business about an hour later, when the voices from inside the house got loud enough to carry through the walls. Or one voice specifically. Blackwood's. "The terms are simple, Jonas. The debt is $800. I have been patient. I think you'd agree I've been remarkably patient. But patience has a limit. I'm here today with a resolution." Ethan moved to the barn door. He could see through the kitchen window. Blackwood was standing at the table. Jonas was seated, which already told you something. Abigail stood against the far wall with her arms crossed over her chest, and even from this distance and angle, Ethan could read the tension in every line of her. "The resolution," Blackwood continued, his voice taking on the smooth, particular quality of a man who has rehearsed this, "is your daughter." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Ethan had heard in weeks. Abigail uncrossed her arms. "She is a sensible woman of reasonable age," Blackwood said. "My previous wife passed 2 years ago. I have a large household and require management. Abigail would be well provided for. The debt would be cleared. The ranch would be safe." Jonas said very quietly, "That's generous," Blackwood supplied. "Yes, I believe it is." "That's not your decision to make," Abigail said. Her voice was calm, dangerously calm. Blackwood turned and looked at her with the expression of a man who is surprised to find furniture has opinions. "Abigail." "Mr. Blackwood." Her voice didn't waver. Not 1 degree. "I am not a line item in my father's debt. I am not a payment arrangement, and I am not going to stand here in my own kitchen and let you describe me as a household management solution." Blackwood's smile thinned. "Your father is sitting right there and can speak for himself." Everyone looked at Jonas, who said nothing, who looked at the table, who did not say a single word in defense of his daughter while she stood 10 feet away and a man offered to buy her. Blackwood set the papers down. "Sign it," he said, "or I take the land. All of it. Tonight." And that was the moment. Not the threat. The silence. The profound, terrible silence from the chair where Jonas Miller sat and did not look up. Abigail looked at her father for a long moment. Then she looked directly out the window. Directly, it seemed to Ethan, at him, though she couldn't have known he was there. She looked like a woman making a decision, not in the dramatic way of stories, in the real way, quiet, private, absolute. The decision was already made somewhere deep and sure, and what was happening on her face was just the rest of her catching up to it. "No," she said, just that word, flat and clear as a bell on cold air. "I won't sign, and I won't be your wife, and I think it's time you left our property, Mr. Blackwood." Blackwood picked up his papers slowly. His face had gone from smooth to something harder underneath, like pavement under snow. He looked at Jonas, who still said nothing, and the contempt in Blackwood's eyes included them both now, which was almost impressive in its efficiency. "This isn't finished," he said. "It is for today," Abigail said. "Goodbye." He left. The expensive horse moved out of the yard. The dust settled. Abigail stood in the kitchen for a moment, and then she sat down heavily in the chair across from her father, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "Abby," Jonas started. "Not tonight," she said. "Please, not tonight." She put her elbows on the table and her face in her hands, not weeping, just carrying it, and Jonas Miller sat across from his daughter and had the grace, at least, to look ashamed. In the barn, Ethan Carter sat back down on his cot. His hands were loose between his knees. He was thinking about Charlotte Haynes, who had wanted his land. He was thinking about every woman he had met in the past 5 years who had wanted something adjacent to him, but not actually him. He was thinking about how he had come out here to discover whether anyone could see past what he had to who he was. And then he was thinking about a woman who had just refused, flat and final, to be bought, who had stood in her own kitchen while her father stayed silent and said no to a powerful man's money and a comfortable life, and the solution that everyone around her was probably hoping she'd accept. Not because she had somewhere better to go, not because she had options lined up, but because she knew what she was worth, even if every single person in her life had spent 28 years suggesting she was worth very little. He thought about that for a long time. Outside, the wind came up and moved through the dry grass with a sound like something breathing, and Harlan Creek settled into the cold dark, and whatever was coming next was already on its way. The morning after Blackwood's visit, nobody at the Miller Ranch talked about what had happened. That was the Miller family way, Ethan had come to understand. Difficult things got buried under the routine of the next day the way snow covers a wound in the ground. You know it's there, you can see the shape of it, but everyone agrees by silent convention not to dig it up. Jonas was at the breakfast table earlier than usual, which meant he felt guilty. Douglas and Frank ate fast and left faster, which meant they knew something had happened and wanted no part of it. And Abigail moved through the kitchen making coffee and cutting bread with the particular economy of motion that meant she was holding herself together through the discipline of staying busy. Ethan ate without comment and went out to start the morning work. But he watched. He had been watching since he arrived, and what he saw now had a different weight to it than it had 3 weeks ago. Before Blackwood's visit, he had seen a woman doing more than her share. Now he saw a woman who had refused something that would have solved her family's immediate problem at the cost of her entire future, and who had woken up the next morning and made breakfast anyway, because the cows still needed feeding and the accounts still needed keeping and nobody else was going to do it. He found her in the feed room around mid-morning, doing inventory with a pencil stub and a worn notebook that had been repaired along the spine with a strip of leather. She was counting sacks, moving her lips slightly, and she didn't hear him come in. "We're going to be short on oats before December," she said, without looking up, because she'd heard his boots by then. "How short?" 40, maybe 50 pounds if we stretch it. She made a note. "I need to talk to Garvey at the feed store about terms. He might let us carry it." Might? She finally looked up, and there was something tired in her face that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago. Or maybe it had always been there, and he'd only just gotten good enough at looking. "He extended us credit twice already this year. He's a decent man, but he has his own family." Ethan leaned against the doorframe. "Is there anything you want to sell? Any animals you've been thinking about moving?" She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was difficult to read. Not suspicious exactly, but measuring. "Why?" "Because I've been here long enough to see how this place runs, and I can see you're the one running it." The silence that followed was not comfortable. She turned back to her notebook. "My father runs this ranch," she said. "Sure." She put her pencil down, turned to face him properly. "What does that mean, sure?" "It means I agree with you." She studied him. "You don't agree with me." "No," he admitted. "I don't." He expected anger. She'd earned the right to anger. Instead, she let out a breath through her nose and picked up her pencil again and went back to her counting. "You've been here 3 weeks, Luke. You don't know how this family works." "You're right." He pushed off the doorframe. "I'll go check the north fence." He was almost out the door when she said quietly, 3 sacks of cornmeal. I've been thinking about selling them back to McKinnon. We bought too much in August, and it's sitting." He stopped, turned around. "If you wanted to help," she said, not looking at him, "you could make that delivery. McKinnon's on the main road, and my brothers keep forgetting to stop." It was the first time she had asked him for anything. "I'll do it this afternoon," he said. "Boss." He did. And while he was there, he also quietly paid off $40 of the Miller feed account at Garvey's store next door, putting it under the name of the account without explanation, telling Garvey only that someone had asked him to settle it. Garvey was a practical man who didn't ask questions when money was moving in the right direction. It wasn't much. He knew that. Against $800 of debt, it was barely a gesture. But he did it because it was something he could do without anyone knowing. And doing things without anyone knowing had become, in recent weeks, the only currency he trusted. October arrived and the temperature dropped, and the work on the ranch shifted into the particular grinding gear of autumn preparation. Storing, repairing, securing, patching everything that hadn't been dealt with all summer because there was always something more urgent. Ethan worked and watched and slowly, without designing it, spent more time in the orbit of Abigail's days. It wasn't romantic, not then. It was something quieter, and in some ways more substantial than romance. He was learning her, the way you learn a piece of land by walking it, where the soft spots were, where the ground was solid, where you had to step carefully. She was not an easy person to know. She had spent too many years with people who used what they knew about her against her, and she protected herself accordingly, with a dry practicality that kept most conversations at a surface level. She talked about the ranch. She talked about weather and animals and logistics. She didn't talk about herself if she could avoid it. But she also couldn't help it sometimes. The real person leaked through the practical one, the way water finds gaps in even well-sealed wood. There was an evening when she was doing the accounts at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed, and Ethan was passing through to get water, and she had a mistake she couldn't find. You could tell by the way her jaw was set, that specific frustrated stillness of a person who knows something is wrong and cannot locate where. And he stopped without asking and looked over her shoulder and found it in about 40 seconds. A transposition error in the August grain column that had been throwing everything off downstream. She stared at it. "I've looked at this 4 times. "Fresh eyes," he said. "Where did you learn to read accounts like that?" He caught himself. Previous job had a lot of record keeping. She looked at him for a moment with that measuring expression again, and he had the feeling, not for the first time, that she was smarter than he was giving her credit for, and possibly smarter than he was. "Thank you," she said. Simple, direct, no performance. He nodded and went to bed and lay there thinking about how rarely anyone had ever thanked him for something that wasn't attached to his money or his land or his name. The next twist in things came on a Wednesday afternoon, and it came from Douglas. Ethan was in the yard splitting firewood. Actual work, the kind that used muscles he hadn't used in a while and left him pleasantly tired, when Douglas came back from town in a mood that was visible from 30 feet. He dismounted harder than the horse deserved, tied up fast and sloppy, and went into the house without looking at anything. Ethan kept splitting. 15 minutes later, Abigail came out of the house with her arms wrapped around herself against the cold and walked to where he was working and stood there for a moment, and something in her face had shifted. "What happened?" he asked. "Blackwood was in town today, talking." She said it flat. "He told people that my father came to him about the debt arrangement, that our family proposed it." Ethan set down the axe. "He didn't say it directly about me," she continued. "He was smart about it. He just said enough that people could put it together, that the Millers were, that I was available, that arrangements were being discussed." She stopped. "Douglas heard it at the saloon." "What did Douglas do?" Something that might have been bitter amusement moved across her face and was gone. "He came home and told my father." "And your father?" "My father said we should probably consider Mr. Blackwood's offer more seriously." The silence between them was the kind that had temperature, cold and flat. "Abigail," he started. "Don't." Her voice was firm without being loud. "Don't feel sorry for me. I can't stand it when people feel sorry for me." She uncrossed her arms. "I just needed to tell someone who wasn't them." He thought about that. "Why me?" She looked at him directly, and he was struck again by the quality of her looking. She didn't glance. She looked, with a steadiness that most people couldn't maintain. "Because you've been here a month, and you haven't tried to tell me what I should do once. Everyone else does. You don't." He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, which turned out to be the right choice. "I'm not going to accept his offer," she said. "I want to be clear about that. Whatever my father thinks, whatever the town thinks. I'm not going to do it." "I know," he said. "You sound very certain for someone who's known me 4 weeks. Some things you can tell." She looked at him for another moment, and then the cold moved through them both, and she went back inside. And Ethan picked up the axe and went back to splitting wood. And his thoughts were a problem he didn't have a solution for yet. What he hadn't told her, what he hadn't told anyone on the Miller ranch, not Abigail or Jonas or the brothers, was that he had sent a letter to Bud Owens 2 days after Blackwood's first visit. He hadn't asked Bud to do anything. He'd just written to let his foreman know where he was and that he was staying a while longer than planned. Bud's reply, which arrived at the post office in town, and which Ethan picked up on the cornmeal delivery, was exactly 8 words long. "Don't do anything stupid. I'll hold things here." Bud had known him for 12 years. He knew what 8 words from Bud meant. It meant Bud understood the situation and was not going to interfere and was also deeply skeptical. The truth was that Ethan was deeply skeptical of himself. He had come here to understand something. He had, in a way he hadn't expected, understood it. He had learned that a woman could do extraordinary work and receive almost no credit for it. He had learned that poverty made certain things about character very clear, very fast, in a way that wealth never did. He had learned that being nobody, at least in this context, meant that whatever people showed you was what was actually there. No performance, no careful management of the wealthy neighbor's impression. And he had learned something about Abigail Miller specifically, which was more complicated. She was not what he'd expected when he arrived. He had expected, if he was honest, someone worn down and accepting. What he found was a person who was worn down and still refusing. Those were not the same thing, and the difference between them was the difference between someone who was losing and someone who hadn't yet decided to stop fighting. He admired that in the abstract. In the specific, it was beginning to be something more than admiration, and that was the problem, because he was here under a name that wasn't his, and eventually that stopped being a practical experiment and started being a lie. He knew that. He was working on it. Pause. The confrontation that broke the fragile peace of the Miller Ranch came on a Saturday, 2 days before the end of October, and it came from the direction Ethan had least expected, Frank. Frank Miller was the quieter of the two brothers, which in this context meant he was merely loud rather than loudly obnoxious, and he had generally made less impression on Ethan than Douglas over the course of the month. He drank less. He worked slightly more. He seemed to have a vague awareness that the ranch was in trouble in a way Douglas hadn't yet absorbed. What Frank had, apparently, been absorbing instead was the sight of his sister talking to the hired hand. It happened after the evening meal. Jonas had gone to bed early with his back again, Douglas was in town, and Ethan had been helping Abigail work through a repair on the barn door that had been sticking since September and would be a real problem once winter set in properly. They'd been at it for about 40 minutes, mostly functional, some conversation, when Frank appeared in the barn doorway. He stood there for a moment without saying anything, in the way that men sometimes do when they want you to notice them before they speak. "Frank," Abigail said without turning around. "It's late," Frank said. He was looking at Ethan. "Door needs fixing before frost," Abigail said. "Harper." Frank's voice had something in it that wasn't quite confrontation, but was its neighbor. "Think we can spare Abby for the evening." Ethan straightened up from the door hinge. "It's her barn. She's my sister." "Frank," Abigail started. "I'm just saying." Frank's jaw was set. There's enough talk in town already without adding to it. The word talk sat in the air between all three of them. Ethan understood what it meant. He understood what Frank was protecting and also understood that the thing Frank was protecting Abigail from was, in Frank's construction, Ethan himself. The unknown man, the drifter, the nobody who'd shown up from nowhere and was spending too much time around the family's unmarried sister. What twisted the moment into something complicated was that Frank wasn't entirely wrong to be suspicious. Not for the reasons he thought, but the underlying instinct, "This man is not who he says he is," was accurate. "I was just helping with the door," Ethan said, keeping his voice level. "Then the door's done," Frank said. Abigail turned around slowly. She looked at her brother with an expression that managed to be calm and cutting at the same time, like a surgical instrument. "The door's done when I say it's done. Abby, I am 28 years old, Frank," each word deliberate. "I have been taking care of this ranch since I was 16. I cooked your supper tonight. I will cook your breakfast tomorrow. I have not once asked you for your opinion on how I spend my evenings or whose company I keep." She picked up the hinge pin from the bench beside her and turned back to the door. "Go to bed." Frank stood there for a moment with the expression of a man who has been out-argued by someone making complete sense and resents it. Then he left. Abigail drove the pin home with 2 clean strikes of the mallet. Ethan watched her and didn't say anything, and the feeling in his chest was something between appreciation and a specific sharp guilt that he was becoming less able to suppress. He almost told her that night. She walked him out toward the barn after the door was finished, the way she sometimes did when the evening had been companionable, And they stood for a moment in the cold yard under a sky that was unreasonably full of stars for how miserable the autumn had been. And she said, "I'm sorry about Frank." "Don't be. He's looking out for you." "In his way." She looked at the sky. "Everyone in my life has an opinion about what I should be doing. My father, my brothers, Blackwood, the town." A pause. "I've been the practical solution to other people's problems for so long I've forgotten what it feels like to be something other than practical." He turned to look at her. She was looking at the stars, and her face in the dark was very still, the kind of still that comes after you've said something true out loud that you've been carrying quietly. "What would you do?" he said. "If it was entirely up to you, no debt, no Blackwood, no family expectation, what would you actually do?" She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that he thought she wouldn't answer. "I'd run a ranch," she said finally, almost to herself. "A real one. One I built, not one I inherited. I'd do the accounts and the decisions and the management, and I'd do it right." A small pause. "I know how. That's the thing nobody around here seems to understand. I actually know how." "I know," he said. She turned to look at him. "You keep saying that." "Because it keeps being true." She looked at him for a long moment in the dark. The stars did their indifferent wheeling overhead. Somewhere down the road a dog barked once and went quiet. "Luke," she said, "who are you?" It was not a casual question. The way she asked it, quiet, serious, without accusation but with real weight, told him she had been thinking about it for a while. The account reading, the knowing too much about feed prices and livestock management for a drifting ranch hand, the things he knew and the things he let slip, and the general shape of a person that didn't quite fit the explanation he'd offered. He stood in the cold and felt the specific gravity of the moment. The right answer was here. He knew it. The right answer was to tell her, right now, who he was and why he'd come, and what he'd seen and what it meant. He almost did. The words were actually in his throat. And then, from down the road, a sound, hoofbeats, more than one horse, moving fast for the hour. And both of them turned toward the road, and whatever moment had existed between them shifted and reconfigured. And Ethan said, "I'll tell you, soon, I promise." She looked at him, and whatever she saw in his face, she made a decision of her own about it, because she nodded, just once, slowly, and went back inside. He stood in the yard and listened to the hoofbeats pass and felt like a man standing on a ledge, deciding whether to step off in the right direction before the ledge ran out from under him. The riders were nobody, just men passing late. But the moment didn't come back that night, and in the morning Blackwood sent a letter. It arrived with the post that Abigail picked up from town, and Ethan saw her open it at the kitchen table and saw her face go through a sequence of expressions that ended somewhere in the vicinity of cold fury. She set the letter down. "He's given us 30 days, she said. No preamble. She knew Ethan was the only person in the room worth telling. Either the $800 is paid in full, or he is initiating legal proceedings to claim the property. Jonas looked up from his coffee. Legal proceedings? He's hired a lawyer. She folded the letter with careful, controlled movements. Someone from Billings. It says here they'll file a claim by the 1st of December. Can he do that? Frank asked. He'd come in for breakfast and was still standing in the doorway. He has documentation of the debt, Abigail said. So yes, he can. She looked at the letter one more time. What he's hoping is that the threat of it is enough, that we'll see no other choice. Jonas rubbed his face. He looked 10 years older than he had in September. $800. Yes. Her voice was steady in the way that cost something. $800. The number sat on the table between all of them like something dead. Ethan looked at it and did the calculation that he'd been not doing for weeks, the one he'd been deliberately not doing because doing it would force a decision. $800. He had that in an account in Helena without noticing its absence. He had that in his pocket, almost literally, in the form of a bank draft he'd carried with him since leaving Carter Ridge, which he'd brought as a failsafe and hadn't touched. He could end this today. Write the draft, hand it to Abigail, watch 30 days of terror dissolve in 30 seconds, and then what? Then explain where a drifting ranch hand got $800. Then explain everything else that came behind that. Then sit across the table from a woman who had told him she'd spent her whole life being treated as other people's practical solution, and watch her realize that she'd been, in a sense, his. The timing was wrong. He knew it, but the timing was running out, and he knew that too. I'll figure out the money, Abigail said quietly, to no one and everyone. She was looking at the folded letter. I'll figure it out. Her father said nothing. Her brother said nothing. The kitchen was full of people who loved her in the abstract and could not help her in the specific, and she sat in the middle of all that useless love and made yet another decision alone. Ethan pushed back from the table and went outside, and stood in the cold morning and looked at nothing and understood that the promise he'd made the night before, soon, he'd told her, soon, had just run out of room to be anything other than now. He went to find her. He had things to say, and the window for saying them was closing with the particular merciless speed of all windows that matter. He found her in the pasture, which was where she always went when she needed to think, and couldn't afford to let anyone see her thinking. She was standing at the fence line looking out at the cattle, with her arms folded against the cold, not really seeing the cattle, and she heard him coming and didn't turn around. I need to tell you something, he said. I figured you'd say that eventually. He came to stand beside her at the fence, close enough to talk quietly. The morning was gray and still, the kind of cold that didn't move or threaten. It just settled in and stayed. He looked out at the same cattle she wasn't seeing and tried to find the right place to start, and couldn't find it, so he started from the wrong place and worked toward the right one. My name isn't Luke Harper. She didn't move. Not even a small movement, the kind people make involuntarily when something unexpected lands. She was very still in the way she got when she was absorbing information and keeping herself contained around it. All right, she said. My name is Ethan Carter. Now she turned. Slowly, the way you turn towards something you're not entirely sure you want to face. She looked at him with an expression that he couldn't read cleanly because it had too many things in it at once, recognition and confusion, and something that might have been the beginning of anger, though it hadn't arrived yet. Carter, she said. Carter Ridge. Yes. She turned back to the fence, looked at the cattle for a real moment this time, actually seeing them. He watched her and waited and did not try to fill the silence because he understood that the silence was hers to fill or not fill as she needed. How long? She said. Since I arrived. The whole time? Yes. She nodded slowly the way people nod when they're confirming something to themselves rather than agreeing with you. The accounts, she said. The feed prices. The way you knew to look at that heifer's eyes before her gate. A pause. You're not a drifting ranch hand. No. You're one of the largest cattle operators in the territory. Yes. She laughed. It was a short, sharp sound. Not pleasant, not unpleasant, just real. The sound of someone encountering something too absurd to respond to with regular emotion. And you came here. I did. Why? He told her. He told her about Charlotte Haynes and the dinner conversation he wasn't supposed to hear, and the drive north to the edge of his property and what he'd thought about sitting there. He told her about wanting to know whether anyone could see him, the actual him, not the operation, not the land, not the number, and deciding that the only way to know was to go somewhere nobody had any reason to see any of those things. He told her about Harlan Creek and the man at the livery and walking down the road with nothing but a canvas pack. He told her all of it. He'd been carrying it for 6 weeks, and it came out without the smoothness of a prepared speech, which was accurate because he hadn't prepared one. It came out in the slightly fractured way of honest things. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. So I was part of your experiment, she said. No. He said it immediately and with more force than he intended. That's not no. What I came here to discover was something about myself. You are not part of that. You are separate from that. We've been talking every day for 6 weeks, Ethan. She said his actual name for the first time, and it sounded different from his mouth than it had from anyone else's in recent memory. You were in my kitchen. You were in my barn. You ate at my table, and I didn't know who you were. I know. Do you understand what that means for someone like me? She turned to look at him fully now, and the anger had arrived, not loud but concentrated, the kind that's more serious than the loud kind. I've been lied to and managed by people my entire life. My father, my brothers, Blackwood, everyone around me has had an agenda they didn't tell me about. I told you things, personal things, because I thought... She stopped. Reset. I thought you were different. I am different. You lied to me for 6 weeks. I know. Those are not mutually exclusive. The silence between them was jagged now. He stood in it because he had no right to try to soften it, and she stood in it because she had every right to be standing in exactly this particular silence. I thought you felt sorry for me, she said. Quieter now, which was somehow worse. When you came out. I thought you finally told me because you heard about Blackwood's letter and felt sorry for the poor Miller woman and wanted to help. I came out because I promised you I would tell you soon and soon ran out. That is not particularly comforting. No, he agreed. It isn't. She looked at him for a long moment. He met her eyes and didn't look away, and didn't offer her the reassurance she hadn't asked for, and he thought for a real and genuine second that she was going to tell him to leave, to take whatever he'd come here to discover back to Carter Ridge, and figure himself out somewhere that didn't cost her anything. He would have deserved that. Instead, she said, the $40 on the feed account. He'd forgotten he'd done that. The fact that she'd found out, and of course she'd found out, she kept every account to the penny, and had said nothing until now told him something about how she operated that he filed away without comment. Yes, he said. That was yours. Yes. You didn't ask. No. She exhaled, long and slow. I don't need you to rescue me, Ethan Carter. I know that too. I am not a charity project. I am not a cause. I am not something broken that needs a wealthy man to come along and set right. Each sentence precise and separate. I have managed this ranch and this family and this impossible situation without anyone's help, and I will continue to manage it. I know, he said. That's actually... He stopped, started again, more carefully. That is the reason I'm still here. Not because I felt sorry for you, because you are the most capable person I have encountered in years, and you have been standing in a situation that doesn't deserve you, and I couldn't walk away from that. She stared at him. You stayed because you thought I was capable. I stayed because I couldn't leave. Something shifted in her face. Not softened. She wasn't a woman who softened quickly, and he didn't want her to, not really. But something moved behind her eyes that was different from anger. I need to think, she said. All right. I mean, I need you to go somewhere else for a while and let me think. All right. He went. He walked back toward the barn, and he did not look back because looking back would have been a manipulation, and he was done with things that were adjacent to manipulation, even small ones, even unintentional ones. He went into the barn and sat on his cot, the narrow, uncomfortable cot in the cold barn where he'd been sleeping for 6 weeks, which was not a sacrifice, which had actually been clarifying in the way he'd hoped. And he waited. She came to him 2 hours later. He was mending a harness that didn't need mending, which was the kind of work you do when you need your hands to be busy and your mind to be somewhere else. He heard her footsteps and didn't look up. I have 2 questions, she said. All right? Did anything you said to me in the past 6 weeks come from anything other than what you actually thought? He considered that honestly. No. I said what I thought. I didn't tell you who I was. Those aren't the same thing. She nodded once, accepting it, or at least holding it. Second question. The debt. Blackwood's 30 days. You have the money. Yes? Are you going to offer it to my father? He set the harness down, looked at her. I'm going to offer it to you. You decide what to do with it. No conditions, no expectations, no rescue. He put deliberate weight on the last word so she'd know he'd heard her. It's money. You need money. I have it. What you do after that is entirely your own business. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that a horse shifted in a neighboring stall and blew air and settled again. "If I take that money," she said slowly, "every person in this town, every person in my family, will say that Abigail Miller finally got a man to save her. They will take the fact and they will build the story they want around it, and that story will follow me the rest of my life." "Probably," he said. "You're not going to tell me that doesn't matter." "No, it matters. You're right that it matters." She looked at him with something that might have been surprise. "Most men would tell me I was being prideful." "Most men haven't watched you run this operation for 6 weeks. She sat down on a hay bale across from him, which was the first time in the entire conversation she'd taken weight off her feet, and he understood that meant something, that she was settling in, not leaving, that the conversation had changed character. "What do you actually want?" she asked. "From this? From me? Say it plainly." He thought about it honestly, the way she deserved. "I want to know you, the real you, not the version you show people to keep them at arm's length. I've seen pieces of that person for 6 weeks, and she is— remarkable is the wrong word because it sounds like a compliment designed to work on you. She is real, in a way most people aren't." He stopped. "That's what I want. Whether that leads anywhere, I don't know. But that's the honest answer." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's either the most genuine thing anyone has said to me in years, or you're very good at knowing what to say." "I'm not good at this," he said. "I'm genuinely bad at it. I've proven that extensively." Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, but the structural precondition for one. "You did lie to me for 6 weeks." "I did, and paid off a piece of my family's debt without asking." "Also, yes." "Those are both quite arrogant things to do." "They are," he agreed. "I'm working on it." The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences. It had less weight in it. Not comfortable exactly. There was still too much between them for comfortable, but the jagged edges had worn down a little. They sat in the cold barn with the horses breathing around them and arrived, independently and without ceremony, at the same approximate place. What happened next came before either of them had fully worked out what they'd decided, which was perhaps appropriate for two people who were both better at doing than planning. Abigail told her father that evening. She told him everything: who Luke Harper actually was, why he'd come, what she now knew. She sat Jonas Miller down at the kitchen table after supper and laid it out the way she laid everything out. Clearly, without drama, all the relevant facts in order. Douglas and Frank were both present, which she hadn't planned but didn't try to prevent either. Jonas listened. His face did several things during the telling that aged him rapidly in the space of 10 minutes. When she finished, Douglas said, "He's Ethan Carter." "Yes." "He's been sleeping in our barn." "Yes." Frank was looking at the table. "He could pay off Blackwood tomorrow." "He offered to," Abigail said. "I haven't decided." Jonas had said nothing through all of this. He was looking at his hands, which were spread flat on the table, and he had the look of a man examining something in himself that he hadn't examined in a long time and didn't like what he found. "Abby," he said finally. His voice was rougher than usual. "Papa, I should have— when Blackwood came—" He stopped, started again. "I should have said something. I should have said no before you had to." The kitchen was very quiet. Abigail looked at her father, at the top of his bent head, at the hands on the table. She had been waiting a long time for something like this, and now that it was here, it didn't feel the way she'd imagined. It felt like watching someone finally admit they were lost, relief and sadness at the same time, and the understanding that admitting it didn't get you home any faster. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry," he said. She nodded. She didn't say it was all right because it wasn't entirely, and they both understood that. And the honesty of not saying it was its own kind of grace. Ethan was called in from the barn. He came into the kitchen and stood near the door and faced Jonas Miller and the two brothers. And there was a moment where the room had the particular atmosphere of a situation that could go several different directions, and nobody was entirely sure which one it was going to choose. Jonas looked at him for a long time. "Why?" he said finally. "Why come here? Why this ranch, this family?" "I didn't know it was this family," Ethan said. I didn't know any of you. I came because I needed to be somewhere nobody knew me. The ranch in town was just the one someone mentioned. And you stayed. I stayed. Jonas turned this over. Because of Abigail. Ethan glanced at her. She was watching him with her arms crossed, face neutral, waiting to see what he said. He looked back at Jonas. Because of a lot of things I hadn't expected to find, yes, including Abigail. Douglas shifted in his chair, and whatever he was going to say, Frank put a hand on his arm and he didn't say it. You'll pay the debt, Jonas said. Not a question exactly, but not a demand either. Something in between. If Abigail wants me to, Ethan said. That's her decision. Jonas looked at his daughter. Something passed between them. Complicated. Old. The specific currency of a relationship that had been damaged and was trying to figure out how to account for it. Let him pay it, Jonas said. Please. It was the please that did it. Abigail had not heard her father say please to her since she was 12 years old. She looked at Ethan. All right, she said, but I'm going with you when you do it. I'm not having anyone in this town think I sent a man to settle my affairs while I stayed home. I wouldn't have expected anything different, he said. Chunk. They went to Blackwood's offices in town the following morning, arriving before 9, so there was no theater of preparation, no opportunity for Blackwood to arrange himself or his position. Ethan had the bank draft. Abigail sat straight in the wagon seat and wore her best coat, which was not a fine coat by any standard, but was clean and pressed, and she carried herself in it like it was. Blackwood's office was in the best building on the main street, which in Harland Creek meant it had 2 stories and a painted sign. His clerk showed them in, and Blackwood looked up from his desk with the expression of a man who has been interrupted at something important, and then he registered both of them standing in his doorway, and his expression shifted through several stages very quickly. He settled on smooth. He was good at smooth. Abigail. He stood. Then, looking at Ethan with precisely calculated interest, And you are? Ethan Carter, Ethan said. Carter Ridge Ranch. The smooth cracked. Just slightly, at the edges, the way ice cracks before it breaks. Blackwood knew the name. Everyone in the territory knew the name. He looked at Ethan, then at Abigail, and Ethan could see the man's mind working, constructing, reassessing the board he'd thought he understood. I wasn't aware you had connections, Blackwood said to Abigail, the word carrying a weight of condescension it was working to conceal. There's a lot you weren't aware of, Abigail said pleasantly. Ethan set the bank draft on the desk. $840. The additional $40 covers an account adjustment I made in September. He looked at Blackwood steadily. The debt is cleared in full. I'll need a signed receipt. Blackwood looked at the draft. Looked at it for a long time. His face was doing the internal math that men do when a situation is moved out of their control and they're trying to find where they still have leverage. This is... Of course, he said. He sat back down. I'll prepare the receipt. While he wrote it, he attempted several times to reestablish some position in the conversation. He commented on Carter Ridge, had heard it was a fine operation. He commented on the autumn season. He commented carefully that he hoped there were no hard feelings about the nature of his previous business with the Miller family, that he had simply been trying to find a resolution that worked for everyone. Abigail said nothing. Ethan said nothing. They waited for the receipt, and the silence they maintained together was the most effective thing either of them did in that room. When Blackwood handed over the receipt, Abigail took it. Not Ethan. She took it and read it carefully, and then she folded it once and put it in her coat pocket. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood, she said. Her voice was perfectly civil. We won't be needing anything else from you. They walked out. On the boardwalk outside in the thin October sun, with the town of Harland Creek moving around them, she stopped and looked at the receipt in her hand and took one long, slow breath. All right, she said quietly. All right, he agreed. They stood there for a moment, 2 people who had just closed one door and were standing in the hall looking at all the others, and neither of them was quite sure what they were doing, which was probably accurate. But Blackwood was not a man who accepted closed doors. Ethan understood this even as they walked back to the wagon, understood it with the particular instinct that comes from having dealt with men like Blackwood in business contexts. Men who presented as reasonable when things were going their way and became something else when they weren't. The debt receipt was a door closing. Blackwood's mind was already looking for a window. He said nothing to Abigail about it on the drive back. She was quiet in the way she was when she was processing, and he gave her the space for it. They were almost back to the ranch when she said, "He's not going to leave it alone." "No," Ethan said. "I don't think he is." "He's going to find another angle." "Probably." She looked at him. "What kind of man is he in your experience? The business type?" He thought about it honestly. The kind who has won most of his fights because the people he was fighting didn't have the resources to fight back properly. He's not used to opposition on equal footing. A pause. He's also the kind of man who takes things personally. This morning is going to bother him for a while. "Good," she said, and turned back to the road. It was the first time he'd heard her say something like that. Not kind, not practical, not self-effacing, just plain satisfaction. He thought about it for the rest of the drive and found that he was glad, genuinely glad to hear it. 3 days later, Ethan received a visitor at the Miller Ranch. Not Blackwood himself. Blackwood was smarter than that. But a man who introduced himself as a representative from the Billings firm of Colton and Reed, attorneys at law, who said he had some questions about the Carter Ridge property and its relationship to certain debts in the Harlan Creek area. The phrasing was legal in the way that means nothing specific but implies everything. Ethan met him in the yard. He was professionally courteous and said almost nothing of substance. And when the man left, he stood in the yard and thought about what Blackwood was building. The most likely shape of it challenged the legitimacy of the debt payment, implies some improper arrangement between Carter Ridge and the Miller family, possibly pursue the original debt claim through a different legal mechanism. None of it would work, because Ethan had done nothing improper and had documentation to demonstrate that, but it would take time and cost money and cause damage, which was the point. Blackwood couldn't win. He could make winning expensive. He went to find Abigail. She was in the kitchen going over the accounts, the real ones now, with the debt cleared, which had given them some breathing room on paper, even if everything else about the ranch's situation remained the same fragile arithmetic. She looked up when he came in. He told her about the lawyer. Her face went still. Then she said, "He's trying to make trouble for Carter Ridge." "Trying to make trouble for both of us," Ethan said. "If he can suggest something improper happened, it undermines the payment. He might also try to argue the original debt agreement had terms that weren't satisfied." "Can he?" "His lawyer can argue anything. Whether it goes anywhere is a different question." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "I have a lawyer in Helena. I'm going to send for him." "This is your problem now," she said. Not accusatory, stating the shape of the thing. "No," he said. "It's ours. He came after your family first. He's using your family's situation as a lever. That's not—" He stopped. "I'm not going to let him do that." She looked at him. "You keep saying, 'I'm not going to let—'" "I know. I'm not yours to protect." "I know that too." He met her eyes. "But I'm in this. I put myself in it when I walked down that road 2 months ago. I'm not walking back out and leaving you with the mess." She studied him for a long moment. Then she looked back at her accounts. "Fine. Get your lawyer." He sent the letter that afternoon, and while he waited for a response, he did what he had been doing for 2 months. He worked. He mended and repaired and managed and was present. And the difference now was that he did it as himself, as Ethan Carter, which felt like taking off a coat you've been wearing so long you forgot it wasn't your skin. It was Frank who changed first. Frank came to him on the 4th morning after the truth had come out, while Ethan was working at the woodpile and stood nearby with his hands in his pockets and his jaw doing the thing it did when he was working up to something. "I owe you an apology," Frank said. "For what?" "For the barn. What I said about—" He stopped. "I was trying to protect her. I know how that sounds now." "It sounds like you were looking out for your sister," Ethan said. "I don't have a problem with that." Frank was quiet for a moment. "She keeps everything running," he said. He wasn't looking at Ethan. He was looking at the woodpile. "You probably figured that out." "Yes. We let her, Frank said. That's the part I don't know how to account for. We just let her. Because she was good at it, and we weren't, and it was easier. He finally looked up. That's not an excuse. I'm not trying to make it one. No, Ethan agreed. It's not. Frank nodded, accepting it. I just wanted to say, she deserves better than what we gave her. He walked away without waiting for a response, which Ethan respected. He went back to splitting wood and thought about Frank's accounting, though we just let her, and understood that there were different kinds of harm, and that the kind done through absence and convenience left marks just as real as the deliberate kind, even if they were harder to name. Abigail came to him that evening, not to the barn, to the fence line where they'd stood the morning he told her, the same fence, the same cold. The cattle moved since then, but the geography otherwise unchanged. She stood beside him, and they looked out at the same direction. I've been thinking, she said. He waited. I can't stay here, she said. Not permanently. This ranch it's not going to survive. My father knows it. My brothers know it. I've known it for 2 years. The land is played out, and we don't have the capital to rest it and rebuild it. And even if we did, we're 3 years behind on where we need to be. She said all of this without self-pity, just inventory. I've been staying because I didn't have anywhere to go. And now? He said carefully. She turned to look at him. In the fading light, she looked tired, and also, underneath the tired, like someone who has recently made a decision they're going to stick with. You told me once that you needed to know whether anyone could see the real man under the wealth and the ranch and the name. Yes. I need you to know something in return. She turned back to the fence. I am not choosing you because you're Ethan Carter. I am not impressed by Carter Ridge or the money or what you represent. If you walked back in here tomorrow as Luke Harper with a canvas pack and no name behind you, my answer would be the same. What's your answer? She was quiet for a moment. I'll come to Carter Ridge. To work. Properly. I want a real position, real responsibilities, real accountability. Not as a charity case or a guest or as someone's... She stopped. I want to work. I know, he said. That's not a problem. And the rest of it, she said more quietly. Whatever the rest of it is between us. We figure that out honestly. Not because you feel responsible and not because I feel grateful, honestly. Yes, he said. That's exactly right. She nodded. One firm nod, settled. The wind came up from the north and moved through the dry grass, and the cattle shifted and breathed, and somewhere back in the house, a lamp came on in the kitchen window, amber and small against the coming dark. They stood there a while longer, two people who had arrived at a real thing by a very crooked road, and neither of them pretended it was anything other than what it was, which was uncertain and complicated and not anywhere near finished. And that honesty was, in its own way, the realest thing either of them had managed in a long time. What was coming next from Blackwood was still coming. The lawyer from Helena hadn't arrived yet. The ranch behind them was still failing. Abigail's family was still a complicated, unresolved thing that she would carry forward into whatever came next. None of that had been resolved. The hard parts were still out there, waiting. But she had made a choice that was entirely her own, for the first time in her life, and she was standing in it with both feet. And Ethan Carter, who had come to this falling down ranch looking for something real and found considerably more than he'd planned for, stood beside her and did not say a word, because there was nothing to say that the standing there didn't already say better. They left Harlan Creek on a Thursday morning, which was not a dramatic day for it, but was the day the Helena lawyer arrived and confirmed that Blackwood's legal maneuvering was exactly as hollow as Ethan had suspected. Aggressive in presentation, weak in foundation, the kind of legal threat that works on people who can't afford to call the bluff. Abigail packed 2 bags. Not because 2 bags was all she owned, but because 2 bags was all she decided to take. And the decision about what to leave behind told you something about how she approached the future, practically, without sentiment about objects, with the understanding that you carry what you need and let the rest be what it is. Jonas stood in the yard when they loaded the wagon. He had aged considerably in the past 2 weeks, not physically, not in the obvious way, but in the way that men age when they stop pretending something to themselves, that they've been pretending a long time. He looked smaller somehow, which was strange because he was still the same size. It was just that the pretense had been taking up space. "You'll write," he said to Abigail. Not a question. "I'll write," she said. He looked at Ethan. He had things he wanted to say and the particular paralysis of men who have spent their lives not saying things. "You'll take care of her," he managed finally. Abigail's jaw tightened. Ethan saw it and spoke before she could. "She'll take care of herself," he said. "I'll be there while she does it." Jonas looked at him for a moment, and then something in his face settled. Not quite relief, but something adjacent. He nodded. He put his hand briefly on Abigail's shoulder, the way men touch their children when they don't know how to embrace them. And she let him. And then she climbed up onto the wagon seat and looked straight ahead at the road. Douglas didn't come out of the house. Frank was at the fence line and raised a hand when they passed, and Abigail raised hers back. And that was the goodbye. They were on the main road out of Harlan Creek before either of them spoke. "You all right?" Ethan asked. "Ask me again in an hour," she said. He didn't ask again. He let the wagon carry them north, and the town fall behind, and the country open up around them the way Montana country does. Enormous and indifferent, and in its own way clarifying, because there is nothing about a landscape that size that allows you to keep pretending your problems are the largest thing in the world. After about 40 minutes, she said, "I'm all right." He nodded. "I thought it would feel different," she said. "Leaving. How does it feel?" She looked at the mountains, which were showing snow on the peaks already, the kind of early November snow that means the real winter is a month behind it. "Like something ended," she said, "and something else hasn't started yet. There's a space in between." "There usually is," he said. She turned to look at him. "Did it feel like that? When you left Carter Ridge to come to Harlan Creek?" He thought about it honestly. "More like jumping off something. I didn't know if the landing was going to be what I needed. Turned out to be more than I'd planned for." She looked at him for another moment and then turned back to the road, and he thought he saw the almost smile again, the structural precondition for one, and that was enough. Well, Carter Ridge Ranch came into view in the late afternoon of the second day, after a night spent at a way station that was functional without being comfortable, and a morning that was cold enough to make conversation harder than it was worth. Ethan watched Abigail's face when the ranch came visible over the last rise in the road, and what he saw there was not the reaction he might have anticipated. She didn't look impressed exactly. She looked evaluating. She was taking in the operation the way she took in everything, methodically, noting what was there and what wasn't, building a picture of the place from its actual components rather than its reputation. She saw the main house and the bunkhouses and the barn complex and the cattle visible in the south pasture, and she was quiet for a while. "How many head?" she asked. "About 1,200 currently. We move that number seasonally." "Fencing condition?" "Good in the main sections. The east boundary needs work before spring." She nodded, making notes in her head. "Who manages the accounts?" "Bud Owens, my foreman, oversees the operations. I've been using a bookkeeper from town who comes in twice a month. The system works, but it's behind where it should be." "How far behind?" 3 months, roughly." She absorbed this. "And the feed rotation?" "Bud manages it. He's good at the physical operations, logistics, scheduling, personnel. The financial side is less natural for him." She was quiet for another moment as they came down the last stretch toward the main gate. "You have a real operation here," she said. It was not a compliment exactly, more an acknowledgement of fact. "Whatever else happened, you built something real." "My father started it," Ethan said. "I continued it. There's a difference." "You continued it well." "I had good help." She looked at him, brief and direct. "You're not going to take a simple observation, are you?" "Not particularly," he agreed. "Well, Bud Owens was waiting in the yard when they arrived, which told Ethan that Bud had been watching the road for the past hour, which told him that Bud was more invested in this situation than the 8-word letter had implied. Bud was 53, built like a barn door, with a gray beard and the kind of face that had been weathered into pure functionality. No softness left in it that wasn't earned. He had worked with Ethan for 12 years, and he had opinions about most things and expressed about a third of them. He looked at Abigail the way he looked at new horses. Not rudely. Bud was not rude, but assessingly, cataloging what he saw and deciding what he thought before he had to say anything. "Bud Owens," he said, extending his hand. "Abigail Miller," she said, and shook it like she meant it. Bud glanced at Ethan with an expression that communicated approximately, "She'll do," which from Bud was substantial. "I've got supper on," Bud said. "Or Rosie does. She came in from town early when she heard." He said this to Ethan with a tone that implied Rosie, the woman who cooked and managed the house, had also been watching the road and was less subtle about it. They went inside. Rosie was a stout woman in her late 40s who had been feeding the Carter Ridge household for 7 years and had very particular opinions about how things should be done, which she expressed freely and without apology. She had set the table for 3, which told Ethan she'd already integrated Abigail's presence into the operation of the house without being asked, which was either welcoming or territorial and was probably both. Supper was a mostly functional affair. Rosie asked questions with the directness of someone who has decided that social niceties are for people with more time. She asked where Abigail was from, what she knew, whether she could ride. Abigail answered everything plainly and without performing, and Rosie gradually rearranged her expression from guarded to provisionally satisfied, which for Rosie was equivalent to an enthusiastic endorsement from anyone else. Bud mostly ate and listened, but once, when Abigail asked a specific question about the east boundary fencing schedule and demonstrated in the asking that she understood the logistics involved, he looked up from his plate with a new quality of attention. "You've done boundary management before," he said. "At a smaller scale, yes." "Miller Ranch, that's in Harlan Creek." "Was." Bud looked at Ethan, then back at Abigail. "How small?" "Small enough that I did most of it alone," she said. Bud picked up his fork again. "We'll get along fine," he said, which was his version of a lengthy speech of welcome. The first weeks at Carter Ridge were a recalibration. Not an easy one. Abigail had been clear about what she wanted, a real position with real responsibility. And Ethan had been equally clear in his intention to give her that. But the space between intention and execution was occupied by about 100 practical frictions that neither of them had fully anticipated. The existing staff had opinions. Not hostile opinions, mostly, but the cautious watchfulness of people who have seen their employer do something unexpected and are waiting to understand what it means for them. The bookkeeper from town, a precise man named Ellery, arrived for his bi-monthly visit and found Abigail already elbow-deep in the accounts he'd been managing and experienced something between professional insult and genuine alarm. Ethan handled Ellery. Abigail handled the accounts. By the end of the first week, she had found 6 discrepancies in the past year's record-keeping. Nothing catastrophic, nothing that pointed to dishonesty, just the kind of accumulated imprecision that happens when someone is doing a job competently, but not with the particular obsessive attention to detail that Abigail brought to numbers. She laid it out for Ethan on a Saturday evening in the office, 4 pages of corrections in her neat, precise hand. He looked at it. "Ellery's been doing this for 2 years. I know, it's not malicious. He just doesn't—" She paused, choosing words. "He doesn't love it. You can tell when someone loves the numbers and when they're just managing them. And you love the numbers." She considered this as if it were a real question. "I love it when they tell me something true," she said finally. "When they add up to an actual picture of what's happening instead of just record-keeping for its own sake." He looked at her 4 pages of corrections and thought about the accounts at the Miller Ranch, kept meticulous in a worn notebook with a pencil stub, for a ranch where every dollar mattered because there weren't enough of them. "You should have been doing this for an operation this size years ago," he said. "Yes," she said simply, not bitter, not wistful, just true. He gave her the accounts formally the following week. Full access, full authority, report to him directly. Ellery was retained for the legal filing work that required his specific expertise, and his expression when Ethan explained the new arrangement was the particular expression of a man who has been professionally outclassed and knows it, and is deciding whether his dignity can accommodate that. Ultimately it could, which Ethan thought well of him for. Blackwood made his next move in November, and when it came sideways. A letter arrived addressed to Ethan from the Colton and Reed firm in Billings, and it was longer and more elaborate than the first legal approach. And what it alleged was this: that Ethan Carter had entered into the Miller household under false pretenses, had gained the confidence of a vulnerable family, and had used that confidence to arrange a financial transaction that benefited his own interests at the Miller family's expense. Specifically, that by paying the debt, he had created an obligation from the Miller family that constituted an improper claim on their remaining property. It was creative. Ethan would give Blackwood that. It was also largely fabricated and internally contradictory in ways that a competent lawyer would disassemble in about 30 minutes. But it was serious enough that it couldn't be ignored. He brought the letter to Abigail. She read it twice. He watched her face while she read, which stayed controlled and analytical throughout, and when she finished, she set it down on the desk and was quiet for a moment. "He's saying you bought us," she said. "He's trying to say that. He's trying to say I'm still a transaction, just with you instead of him." She looked up. "He's angry. This isn't about money anymore. This is about the fact that we walked into his office and took back the terms." "Yes," Ethan agreed. "That's my reading." "He'll go to my father," she said. "He'll try to get my father to file something or sign something because my father is more vulnerable to that kind of pressure than I am." She was already 3 moves ahead. He'd noticed this about her. She didn't just assess a situation, she played it forward, running the consequences of different responses the way a chess player does, except she'd taught herself the game with no one to teach her. "I've already written to Thomas Hale," Ethan said. Hale was the lawyer in Helena he'd used for Carter Ridge business for 8 years. "He'll be here by end of the week." "I want to be in that meeting," Abigail said. "Of course." She nodded. Then, "I should also write to my father before Blackwood does, warn him, tell him exactly what's happening and what not to sign if anyone presents him with anything." "Do you think your father will hold?" She thought about it, and what crossed her face in that moment was something complicated. The particular weight of loving someone you cannot entirely trust, the specific sorrow of knowing a person's limits because you've watched them fail against those limits before. "I think he'll try," she said. "I don't know if trying will be enough." She wrote the letter that evening. Ethan saw her at the desk after supper, writing and stopping, the way you do when the person you're writing to requires you to choose every word with care because the wrong word will land wrong, and that matters. She wrote 4 pages and threw away 2 before she got to something she was satisfied with. He didn't ask what she'd written. It wasn't his to ask. Thomas Hale arrived on a Friday and was everything Ethan remembered: small, precise, with the particular energy of a man who found the law genuinely interesting rather than merely profitable. He read Blackwood's letter, asked several questions, and then sat back in his chair with the expression of someone who has just been handed a problem they find professionally enjoyable. "This is thin," he said. "The core argument, Kokecho, that paying the debt created an obligation, fails on its face because the payment was unconditional. Do you have the receipt?" Abigail produced it. She had the receipt. She had been carrying it since the day they'd walked out of Blackwood's office. Hale examined it. "This is clean. No conditions stated. Payment in full." He set it down. "What Colton and Reed are doing is trying to characterize the entire relationship, your time at the Miller Ranch, as a scheme. They'll want to depose you. They'll want documentation of your finances and your movements." "That's all available," Ethan said. "The more interesting question," Hale said, looking between both of them, "is what Blackwood's actual end goal is here. Because this suit doesn't win. He has to know that." He folded his hands. "So what is he trying to accomplish by filing it?" "Pressure," Abigail said. Hale looked at her. "Explain." "He can't win the legal argument, but if he can sustain the filing long enough, he creates a period of uncertainty for Carter Ridge. Ethan's name is associated with an ongoing dispute. Business contacts start asking questions. People hesitate." She paused. "And in the meantime, he goes to my family and tries to get something from them. A statement, a signature, something that he can use to give the case more substance than it has." Hale looked at her for a moment, then at Ethan. "Where did you find her?" "Harlan Creek," Ethan said. "Lucky," Hale said, which was his version of high praise. He turned back to Abigail. You're right, that's the structure of it, which means our counter isn't just to defend. We need to go at Blackwood directly. What does that look like? Ethan asked. We start looking at Blackwood's other business, Hale said. A man who runs debt arrangements with struggling families and then uses those debts to make marriage proposals isn't doing that once. He's doing it as a pattern. If we can document the pattern, we can reframe this entire situation. Blackwood isn't the aggrieved party, he's the predator who got stopped. The word hung in the room for a moment. Abigail said quietly, How many families, do you think? That's what we find out, Hale said. It took 3 weeks to find the first one, then 2 more, then 4 more after that. Hale had a network of contacts across the territory, other lawyers, county clerks, men who handled probate and property records. And through that network, a picture began to assemble itself of Harold Blackwood's operations over the previous decade. He had extended credit to 18 struggling operations in 3 counties. Of those 18, 11 had ultimately lost property or signed agreements that benefited Blackwood. Of the 11, at least 3 had involved arrangements similar to what he'd proposed for Abigail, debt cleared in exchange for a family member, usually a daughter, sometimes a widow. When Hale laid the documentation out on Ethan's office desk, it covered the entire surface. Abigail stood across the desk and looked at it for a long time. 18 families, she said. That we've found, Hale said. I almost became number 4, she said. Not to anyone in particular, just placing herself in the picture. If I hadn't said no. If my father had made that decision without me. You said no, Ethan said. I almost didn't, she said, and this was something he hadn't heard from her before. The admission of the almost, the near miss, the version of events where she'd been more tired or less stubborn, or had trusted her own judgment slightly less. She said it plainly, without drama, just making sure the full picture was accurate. I almost didn't, and 3 other women didn't at all. The silence in the room was serious. What do we do with this? Ethan asked Hale. We take it to the county sheriff and the district court simultaneously, Hale said. We present it as a pattern of predatory lending and coerced arrangements. The legal mechanism is a complaint of fraud and undue influence. He paused. It won't be fast, and Blackwood will fight it. Let him fight it, Abigail said. Her voice was even, but had something new in it. Not anger exactly, or not only anger, something more purposeful than anger, the kind of feeling that has converted itself into forward motion. Those other families, can we contact them? Hale looked at her. Some of them. Some may not want to be named. I understand that, she said. But if any of them are willing to come forward, we should know. She looked at Ethan. We should know. He looked at her across the desk with all of Blackwood's documentation between them and thought about the woman who had stood in a kitchen in Harlan Creek and said no, flat and final, to a powerful man's offer, with her father silent across the table and no backup and nowhere else to go. He thought about what it had cost her to say that word, how much she'd been carrying alone when she said it, and what it meant now that she was standing in a different room with different resources and turning that word into something larger than a single refusal. Yes, he said. We should know. The weeks that followed were difficult in the particular way of doing hard things correctly. Hale filed the complaint. Blackwood's lawyers responded with predictable ferocity. There were hearings scheduled and postponed and rescheduled, documents requested, statements taken. The Billings firm tried twice more to implicate Ethan in an improper arrangement and failed both times because there was nothing improper to find. 2 of the 3 women Blackwood had coerced into arrangements were willing to be named in supporting statements. One of them traveled to meet Hale personally, a woman in her early 40s from a ranch in the next county, who sat across from Abigail in the Carter Ridge parlor and told her what had happened to her family without flinching and without asking for sympathy. The 2 women looked at each other across the parlor table with the specific recognition of people who have survived the same storm from different angles. Why now? The woman asked Abigail. Why did you fight when others didn't? Abigail thought about it honestly. I didn't have enough left to lose, she said. Sometimes that's all courage is. The woman nodded slowly. I had too much left to lose, she said. Children. A sick husband. Blackwood knew exactly what he was working with. He still does, Abigail said. He picked his targets carefully. A pause. But he miscalculated with me. Why? Because I didn't have anyone to protect, Abigail said. Just myself. And I'd spent enough years not protecting myself. Bud Owens knocked on the office door on a Tuesday afternoon in December and came in with the particular expression he reserved for things that required him to say more than he wanted to. "There's talk in town," he said. Ethan looked up from the papers he was reviewing. "What kind?" "The good kind, for a change." Bud was quiet for a moment, working up to something. "People are saying what Blackwood's been doing to families around here. Word's gotten out about the other women, about the filing." He paused. "People are talking about Miss Miller specifically, what she did, walking away from the offer, coming forward." "What are they saying?" Bud looked at the ceiling briefly, which was what he did when he was going to say something that cost him some pride to say. "They're saying she's braver than most men they know." He brought his eyes back down. "Which is true." "So." Ethan let that sit. "Does she know?" "I doubt she'd care," Bud said, which was both true and also, Ethan thought, not completely accurate. Abigail had spent 28 years being described as insufficient by the people around her. The recalibration of that description, even if she'd never admit it mattered. He went to find her. She was in the south pasture doing a cattle count, which she did every 2 weeks because she'd discovered early on that the count had been done monthly and thought that wasn't frequent enough and had simply changed the schedule without asking anyone. Bud had raised an eyebrow and then agreed with her assessment, and now it was monthly. She was moving through the herd with the ease of someone who had spent her life around cattle, which she had, making notes, and she heard him coming and waited for him to reach her. He told her what Bud had said. He told her plainly, without embellishment, because she didn't need embellishment and wouldn't have wanted it. She was quiet for a moment. The cattle moved around them, their breath visible in the cold. "They didn't say that when I was in Harlan Creek," she said. "No, they didn't." She looked at a young heifer that was crowding close out of curiosity, reached out and pushed it gently back by the nose, the automatic gesture of someone who has been handling cattle since childhood. "I don't need them to say it now," she said. "It doesn't. I don't need that." "I know," he said. "I just thought you should know." She turned to look at him directly, the full attention of those steady eyes. "Why?" He didn't have a polished answer. "Because you spent a long time in a place that couldn't see you clearly, and now some people are starting to. And I thought that was worth knowing, even if it doesn't change anything about what you're doing." She held his gaze for a moment. Something moved through her face that she didn't try to control the way she usually did, something more open than her default, more in motion. Then she turned back to the cattle. 43 in this section," she said, resuming the count. 2 short of last week. Bud needs to check the east fence." "I'll tell him," Ethan said. He stood in the cold pasture for another moment, watching her work, and thought about all the things she did and how she did them. Without fanfare, without waiting for acknowledgement, with the steady competence of a person who has internalized the truth that the work matters more than whether anyone notices the work. And he thought that whatever the courts decided about Blackwood, whatever shape the future took from here, he was standing next to something that was genuine, and he knew it, and he was not going to be stupid enough to pretend otherwise or clumsy enough to ruin it by moving too fast. He went to tell Bud about the east fence, and Abigail Miller finished her count in the cold south pasture of Carter Ridge Ranch, standing in a place she had earned through nothing except her own insistence on her own worth, with the hard part still ahead and the harder part already behind her, and the long, complicated middle of a real life stretching out in every direction she looked. The district court hearing was scheduled for the second week of January, which gave Blackwood's lawyers 6 more weeks to maneuver and gave Hale 6 more weeks to build, and the difference between those two activities, maneuvering versus building, told you everything about the difference between the two sides. Hale built. He was methodical and patient and slightly obsessive in the way that good lawyers are. The kind of obsessive that looks like calm from the outside but is actually relentless attention running underneath a composed surface. He added 2 more families to the documentation. He located a county clerk in Billings, who had processed several of Blackwood's property acquisitions and had questions about the paperwork he'd never formally raised. He found a former employee of Blackwood's lending operation, a young man who had kept his own notes, quietly, because something in his conscience had told him to, who was willing to provide a written statement. Abigail read everything Hale produced, not because Ethan asked her to, but because she had appointed herself to the role of second set of eyes on anything connected to the case, and Hale had accepted this after the third time she caught something he'd glossed over and turned out to be right about it. By December, she was effectively functioning as a paralegal, which was not a word anyone used because it didn't exist yet in that form in 1887, but was accurate in its description. "You should have been a lawyer," Hale told her one afternoon, without particular emphasis, the way he said most things. "Women aren't lawyers," she said. "Not yet," he said, and went back to his papers. She thought about that for the rest of the day. Ethan watched her through December and understood something about himself that he hadn't understood before. He had come to Harlan Creek looking for a particular kind of answer. Can anyone see me, the real me, outside of what I own? And he had gotten that answer, but it had turned out to be a smaller question than the one that had replaced it. The replacement question was this: what do you do when you find a person who is more than you expected? In a context where you've complicated everything by lying to them for 6 weeks, and you don't want to move too fast because fast would be wrong, but you also can't stay indefinitely in this middle distance because middle distances are their own form of dishonesty? He didn't have an answer. He lived in the question and did the work and let things develop at the speed they were going to develop at, which required more patience than he was naturally inclined to, but which felt correct. They had a rhythm by now, he and Abigail. Morning coffee in the kitchen before Rosie arrived, which had begun accidentally in the first week when they'd both been up early and had evolved into something neither of them named or formalized, but which both of them showed up for. She brought the account books sometimes. He brought the correspondence. They worked in companionable parallel, talking when there was something to say and not talking when there wasn't. And this was somehow more intimate than anything that would have announced itself as intimate. Rosie had noticed. Rosie noticed everything and said most of what she noticed, which was one of her qualities that was both her best and most alarming trait. "You're going to have to say something eventually," she told Ethan one afternoon in the kitchen, with the directness of a woman who had been feeding this man for 7 years and felt she'd earned it. "Rosie, I'm not asking you to marry her tomorrow," she said, stirring something vigorously. "I'm saying the two of you have been orbiting each other for 2 months like you're both waiting for the other one to admit gravity exists. It's exhausting to watch." "We have a lot going on right now," he said. The case will settle," she said, "and then there'll be something else. There's always something else. The something else doesn't stop." She pointed the spoon at him. "You know what you want. The question is whether you're going to keep being polite about it until she thinks you don't." He thought about that longer than he should have needed to. Christmas came to Carter Ridge the way it came to working ranches everywhere. Acknowledged but not elaborate, with the understanding that the cattle still needed feeding and the weather didn't observe holidays. Rosie made a proper dinner. Bud came in from the bunkhouse and sat at the table with them, which he did at Christmas and Easter and otherwise ate with the other hands. There were no other guests. Ethan had not given Abigail anything, which he had thought about and decided against twice, for reasons that were not quite clear to him but had something to do with not wanting her to feel the weight of obligation or the wrong kind of attention. He had given Rosie a new set of pots she'd been wanting and given Bud a saddle fitting she'd needed for a year. And those were easy because they were straightforward. Abigail solved the problem for him by giving him something first. After dinner, when Bud had gone back to the bunkhouse and Rosie was in the kitchen doing something with considerable noise, she set a small package on the table in front of him, wrapped in brown paper, tied with kitchen twine. He looked at it. "You didn't have to—" "I know I didn't have to," she said. "Open it." He opened it. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, small enough to carry in a coat pocket, with his initials pressed into the cover. Not embossed fancy, just pressed, done by hand, the kind of tooling you do yourself if you know how. Inside the front cover she had written, in her clean, precise hand, "For the things you notice when nobody knows you're watching." He looked at it for a moment. It's practical, she said, which was her version of backtracking slightly when a gesture had landed more vulnerably than she'd planned. You're always picking up correspondence and making notes on the backs of envelopes. It's not practical, he said. It's personal. She looked at him. The kitchen sounds from Rosie continued, and the fire in the hearth was doing what fires do, and the house was warm in the specific way of a house that has been kept and cared for. And he looked at her across the table and decided that Rosie was right, and the right moment was as close to now as he was going to get. Abigail, he said. Don't, she said immediately. Don't what? Don't say whatever you're about to say right now, tonight, on Christmas, after I gave you something personal, because then I will never know whether... She stopped. Reset. I don't want you to say it because it's the right moment. I want you to say it when you can't not say it. He looked at her. That's a real distinction, she said, her voice slightly less steady than she'd have liked. I've had people do things for me because it was the right time, or the right practical arrangement, or the right solution. I don't want... She stopped again. I'm not explaining myself well. You're explaining yourself perfectly, he said. You want to know it's real and not circumstantial. Yes. Said with the relief of a person who has been understood. Exactly that. He nodded. He put the notebook down on the table. All right, he said. Then I'll wait until I can't not say it. She looked at him steadily. How long do you think that will be? Not long, he said honestly. Something moved across her face that was not the almost smile, that was the actual thing, quick and real and then contained again, and she looked down at the table and then back up. Good, she said, and then, Merry Christmas, Ethan. Merry Christmas, Abigail. The hearing convened on January the 14th, 1888, in the county courthouse in Billings, which was a 3-day ride, and which Ethan and Abigail made with Hale and one of his associates in a cold that was serious enough to make the horses unhappy about the whole enterprise. Blackwood was already there when they arrived at the courthouse, standing with his 2 lawyers in the entrance hall, and the moment he saw Abigail, his expression went through the same sequence it had gone through in his office 2 months earlier. Smooth first, then something harder underneath when the smooth didn't land the way he wanted. He had aged since September, not dramatically, but the specific aging that happens to men who have been building something carefully for years and have watched it start to crack. He didn't speak to either of them. His lead lawyer nodded at Hale with professional courtesy, and they all went in. The hearing lasted 2 days. Ethan had been in legal proceedings before, property disputes, contract matters, the ordinary friction of running a large operation, and he knew the particular rhythm of them, the alternation of tedium and sharpness, the moments where everything suddenly mattered and the long stretches where nothing seemed to. He sat in the gallery for the parts where his presence wasn't required and watched. Abigail sat beside him for all of it. She watched the proceedings with the focused attention she brought to accounts, missing nothing, occasionally writing a small note on the paper she'd brought for the purpose, which she passed to Hale twice and which caused him both times to make a quiet adjustment to his approach. The woman from the next county gave her statement on the second morning. She sat straight in the chair and spoke in a clear, flat voice about what had happened to her family, and the courtroom was very quiet while she spoke, and Blackwood sat at his table and looked at his folded hands and did not look at her. Then Abigail gave hers. She had not told Ethan exactly what she was going to say, and he had not asked. She took the chair and settled into it and looked at the judge, not at Blackwood, not at his lawyers, not at Ethan, and told what had happened from the beginning. The debt, the visit, the offer. What it had felt like to stand in her own kitchen while a man described her as a household management solution. She was not emotional in the performance of it. That was not her nature. She was precise and sequential and honest, including about the parts that weren't flattering to herself. The years of silence before the refusal, the family that didn't protect her, the moment she had almost said nothing. She included the almost because the truth required it. Blackwood's lawyer tried to rattle her on cross-examination. He asked whether she had been in financial distress. She confirmed she had. He asked whether she had subsequently accepted financial support from Ethan Carter. She confirmed she had, in the form of debt payment, unconditionally given, and produced the receipt. He tried to imply a prior arrangement. She dismantled the implication with the same calm economy with which she corrected accounts. At one point, the lawyer suggested that a woman in her position might be expected to be grateful for Mr. Blackwood's attention. Abigail looked at him for a moment. "I was not looking for attention," she said. "I was looking to be left alone, which is a thing women rarely get credit for wanting." The judge made a sound that was technically neutral. Hale did not smile, but his ears moved slightly. The ruling came on the last day of January, delivered in writing to Hale's office in Helena, and he brought it to Carter Ridge personally rather than sending it by post, which told Ethan before he opened the envelope that it was good news, because Hale's professional affect did not allow for the personal delivery of bad news. He processed those by letter, at a distance, with careful written language. Abigail was in the office when Hale arrived. She was always in the office by that hour. She looked at the envelope and at Hale's face and read both correctly. Hale opened the envelope himself and read the relevant section aloud. The court found in favor of the complaint. Blackwood's countersuit was dismissed. His pattern of predatory lending arrangements was formally documented in the ruling as a matter of public record. The court recommended the case be forwarded to the Territorial Attorney's Office for review of potential criminal fraud charges. The Territorial Attorney's Office, which meant it wasn't over, legally, but it was over in the way that mattered. The finding was on record, the pattern was named, the names of the women he had coerced were attached to a documented truth that could not now be unmade. Abigail read the ruling herself when Hale handed it to her. She read it the way she read everything, all of it, carefully, to the end. Then she set it down on the desk and was quiet for a moment. "The criminal charges," she said to Hale. "What does that mean for the families he took property from?" "It could mean restitution," Hale said. "If it gets that far. It depends on the territorial attorney and the evidence and whether anyone wants to pursue it." "Someone should pursue it," she said. "Someone probably will," Hale said. "The ruling makes it easier. The documentation is there now." She nodded. She looked at the ruling once more and then looked up at Ethan. He was watching her from across the desk, and what he saw on her face was not triumph, which was what he'd expected. It was something quieter and more durable than triumph. The particular expression of a person who has fought something real and seen it land real and knows that matters, and also knows that mattering isn't the same as solving everything. "Good," she said, simply, as she'd said it when Blackwood left his offices that morning. Yesab. The letter from Jonas Miller arrived the following week. Abigail read it at the kitchen table in the morning before Ethan came down, and he found her there with the letter in her hands and her coffee going cold beside her. He sat down across from her and waited. "He sold the East Acreage," she said. "The piece that was always going to go first. He got a fair price, better than I expected." She paused. "Douglas and Frank are staying to work the remaining section. They're going to try to run it properly this time." "Do you think they will?" She considered it honestly. "I think Douglas might surprise me," she said. "Frank already is, facing it instead of around it, I mean." She set the letter down. "My father says he's sorry again. He says it differently this time. Less like he's trying to make it right and more like he's just acknowledging it. That something happened and he didn't stop it and he's sorry." Ethan watched her face. "Is that better?" "Yes," she said after a moment. "It's actually better. The first sorry wanted me to feel better about him. This one doesn't ask me for anything." She folded the letter. "I'm going to write back and tell him to come for a visit this spring, if he wants to." "Do you want him to?" She looked at him steadily. Yes. I want him to see this, what I'm doing here. I want him to see it and understand what he almost didn't give me the chance to have." Her voice was even, but something in it was not, in the way of someone being truthful about something that still hurt around the edges. "Not to punish him, just because it would be true, and we don't have enough truth left to waste any." He nodded. He picked up his coffee and held it and thought about fathers and daughters and the specific damage of love that doesn't know how to show up correctly, and how some of that damage gets repaired and some of it just gets lived with, and how living with it honestly was its own kind of repair. "Write him," he said. "Tell him spring." February at Carter Ridge was deep winter and deeply unglamorous. The work contracted to the essential: keeping the animals alive, keeping the systems functioning, maintaining what had been built against the pressure of cold and wind and the particular misery of frozen water troughs. Ethan worked alongside Bud and the hands the way he always did in winter, physically, with his own body, because it was necessary and because he preferred it to sitting inside. Abigail continued the accounts and added something new. She had begun a reorganization of the operational records going back 3 years, building a comprehensive picture of the ranch's productivity patterns so that decisions about next year's cattle movement could be made from data rather than habit. Bud had looked over her initial summary with the expression of a man who has been doing something adequately and has just been shown what it would look like done excellently. "If we'd had this 3 years ago," he said, "we'd have moved the summer herd 2 weeks earlier last August and avoided the weight loss." "I know," she said, not unkindly. "I'm not arguing," Bud said. "I'm saying yes." It was from Bud Owens a form of surrender and also a form of respect, and both of them understood it as both. Ethan heard about the exchange from Rosie and said nothing because saying something would have made it smaller. "Tets," he told her in February, not because he planned to. He had made no particular plan, because every time he made a plan for it, the plan felt wrong, but because they were walking back from the South pasture on a Tuesday evening in the last week of the month, and the cold had eased slightly, and the sky was doing something interesting with the last light, going from orange to a particular deep blue that happened sometimes in winter and didn't last long, and she stopped walking to look at it. And he stopped because she did, and they stood there for a moment in the cold and the extraordinary light, and he couldn't not say it. "I love you," he said. He said it plainly, without preamble, without building up to it, just the true thing placed down simply, the way she placed true things down. She kept looking at the sky for a moment. He stood beside her and did not qualify it or add to it because it was complete as it was. Then she turned and looked at him. The sky was doing its impossible blue behind her, and she looked at him with the full quality of her looking, the kind that doesn't glance. "I know," she said. "That's not—" He stopped. "That's not an answer." "I know it's not." She turned back to the sky, which was already beginning to darken. "I'm thinking." He waited. "I love you," she said finally, still looking at the sky, as if the admission was easier directed at something that wasn't looking back. "I've known it for a while. I didn't want to say it before I was certain I was saying it because it was true, and not because I was grateful or relieved or— You don't owe me an explanation for your timing," he said. "I know I don't." She turned to look at him again. "I'm giving you one anyway." He looked at her in the fading blue light and thought about 6 weeks in a barn in Harlan Creek and a woman at a fence line and the specific weight of the word no, said with both feet on the ground. He thought about her at the courthouse speaking the truth without performance. He thought about the notebook with the pressed initials and for the things you notice when nobody knows you're watching. "All right," he said. "I'll take it." Something crossed her face that was not controlled at all, that was just real, and she reached over and took his hand, which was the first time she had reached for him rather than waiting to see what he'd do. And that meant more than she probably knew it meant, though on reflection he thought she probably knew exactly what it meant. They stood in the last of the blue light, and then it was dark, and they walked back to the house with her hand in his, and neither of them said anything else, because there was nothing else that needed saying just then, and they had both spent enough of their lives filling silence with words that didn't improve it. The spring came properly in April, and Jonas Miller came with it. He arrived on a Tuesday, which was not a planned detail but felt like one. Tuesdays had been Ethan's first day at the Miller Ranch, and first days in the autumn of Abigail's departure, and now a first of another kind, Jonas stepping down from a borrowed horse into the yard of Carter Ridge, with his hat in his hands and age in his face, and the particular posture of a man who has thought for a long time about something, and has finally arrived at where the thinking led him. Abigail went out to meet him. Ethan watched from the porch and stayed where he was, because this part was not his. Father and daughter stood in the yard for a moment, and Jonas said something Ethan couldn't hear, and Abigail was still for a moment, and then she put her hand on her father's arm. Not a hug, not quite, just that hand on his arm, both careful and present, and said something back. Jonas nodded slowly. He wiped his face with the back of his hand in the way of men who are crying, without wanting to call it that. Ethan went inside and asked Rosie to set another place for dinner. Jonas stayed 4 days. He was quieter than Ethan remembered from the Miller Ranch, but not the same kind of quiet. The Harlan Creek quiet had been avoidance, the absence of a man who wasn't willing to be present. This was different. He asked questions about the operation. He watched Abigail work with visible attention, the kind of attention that is trying to make up for years of its own absence, doing fast what it should have done slow and steady. On the 3rd morning, he came to find Ethan in the barn. He stood near the door for a moment, in the way men do when they have something they want to say and need a moment with the saying of it. "You're going to ask her," Jonas said. Not quite a question. "Yes," Ethan said. Jonas looked around the barn. "She'll say yes. I hope so." "She will." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't see her," he said. "For a long time I didn't. I looked at her every day, and I didn't actually see what was there." He stopped. "I don't know if that gets better, if I can make it better." "I don't know either," Ethan said. "But you came. That's a real thing." Jonas nodded. He put his hat back on. "Take care of her," he said, and then stopped and almost smiled, a tired, self-aware smile. "I know, she takes care of herself." "She does," Ethan said. "I'll be there while she does it." Jonas looked at him for a long moment. Then, "Good," he said, and walked back out into the spring morning. Ethan asked her on a Sunday in May, in the South pasture, because that was where she was when the moment arrived, and he had decided after February that moments were not things you manufactured, but things you recognized. She was counting cattle. She was always counting cattle. And he came up beside her and waited for her to finish the section she was on, because interrupting her count was a thing she found genuinely irritating, and that boundary had been established early and firmly. She finished, made her note, looked at him. "What?" "Marry me," he said. She looked at him for a long moment with that full looking she did. The cattle moved around them. The spring was warm enough finally to be actual warmth rather than the absence of cold, and the grass was coming in on the south pasture, and the mountains in the distance still had snow on the peaks, but it was the last of it. "All right," she said. He blinked. "That's it? Did you want more?" "I thought there might be more." She looked at him with the expression that meant she found him somewhat exasperating and also entirely acceptable. "Ethan, I told you in February. You're just now asking officially." "It's been 3 months." "It has," she agreed without apology. He laughed. Not performed laughter, actual laughter, the kind that comes from something landing unexpectedly true. She watched him laugh with the expression that was by now the actual smile, not its precondition, the real one that reached all the way to her eyes. "All right," he said when he'd stopped. "All right. I have 6 more in this section," she said, and turned back to the cattle. He stood beside her in the warm May morning and watched her count and thought about all the ways he'd imagined this might go, and none of them had included this particular version, which was better than any of them. They married in June, in a ceremony that was small because Abigail wanted small. She'd said specifically that she'd spent enough of her life being overlooked that she was not interested in performing visibility for a crowd of people who'd had nothing to do with getting her here. The people at the wedding were the people who'd been present for the actual story. Hale, who remained professionally composed throughout and wiped his eye once when he thought no one was looking. Bud, who wore a clean shirt and stood very straight and said afterward that it was a fine thing, which was the most expansive thing anyone had heard him say about anything. Rosie, who cried openly and without embarrassment and made a cake that took 2 days and was excessive in the best way. Jonas, who sat in the front row and watched his daughter marry in the dress she'd chosen herself, and had the particular expression of a man doing something he should have done years earlier, which was paying attention. Frank came. Douglas sent a letter saying he couldn't make the travel and the ranch needed him, which was either true or the easier version of something more complicated, and Abigail received the letter without visible judgment and set it aside because Douglas was Douglas, and always had been, and she had made her peace with the arithmetic of that. There was a moment at the ceremony, simple, outdoors, in the yard of Carter Ridge, which Rosie had made presentable with flowers she'd grown herself, when Ethan looked at Abigail and she looked at him, and he thought about the man who had walked down a dirt road in September with a canvas pack and nothing else, and a question he didn't know how to answer any other way. He had found his answer, though it turned out to be a different answer than he'd gone looking for. He'd gone looking to know whether he could be seen. What he found was a woman who'd spent her entire life not being seen and had refused to disappear anyway, and in watching her refuse, he had become the kind of man who deserved to be seen. The becoming was the answer. He just hadn't known that when he started. She said "I do" in the same voice she said everything, clear and direct and without performance. He said it the same way. Associés. The years that followed were not without difficulty, because years without difficulty belong to different kinds of stories. The criminal fraud case against Blackwood moved slowly through the territorial legal system with the pace of all such things, the kind of pace that frustrates everyone and is nevertheless better than no pace at all. In the spring of 1889, the territorial attorney secured a formal fraud conviction on 3 counts. Blackwood's properties were partially liquidated. 2 of the families he'd taken land from received partial restitution, which was not all they deserved and was more than they'd expected. Blackwood himself moved east somewhere, Wyoming, someone said, then another state after that. He had the ability of men like him to reconfigure in new places, and Ethan suspected he was doing exactly that, and that someone else was going to have to deal with him eventually, and that the most useful thing was to have made it harder for him, and to have made the record, and to have made certain that the women who'd faced him had their truth attached to documented history. That was a real thing. Not a complete thing, but real. Abigail ran the Carter Ridge accounts and expanded the operational planning function into something that Bud freely admitted had changed how the whole ranch functioned. She developed a feed and grazing rotation system that became, in a modest way, something other ranches in the territory started asking about. She hired 2 women in the following years, one for accounts, one for operations support, which was unusual enough to generate comment, and which she received with her standard combination of practicality and complete indifference to the opinion. She wrote to her father regularly. He visited twice more in the years that followed. Their relationship became what it was going to be: honest, imperfect, shaped by what had been damaged and what remained. They never had the relationship they might have had if Jonas Miller had been a different man in his daughter's childhood. That was a loss that existed alongside the real affection and couldn't be resolved by the affection, only companioned by it. Abigail understood this and carried it and did not pretend it was other than it was. One afternoon, maybe 2 years into it, she told Ethan something she'd never told anyone. They were in the office after the evening work, which was where they often ended up, and she said it without preamble, the way she said everything. I used to think being invisible was the price of being who I was, that I was just the kind of person who didn't get noticed, not because of anything specific, just the way some things don't. He waited. I still don't entirely understand why it changed, she said. It doesn't feel like I changed. I feel like myself. The same person in Harlan Creek who never got thanked for anything. She looked at her hands on the desk. I think the difference was just, I stopped accepting it. I stopped treating it as the truth about me and started treating it as wrong. And those aren't the same. He thought about that. You said no to Blackwood before I told you who I was, he said. Before any of this. Yes. So the change had already happened. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said again, more slowly, as if working out the shape of something. I think it had. I think I was just ready. I'd been invisible for so long that invisibility stopped feeling safe and started feeling like a slow disappearance. She looked up at him. I didn't want to disappear. You didn't, he said. No. She looked back at her hands. I didn't. There is a particular truth in that, the one she landed on at that kitchen table, the one that Ethan recognized as the kind of truth you can't manufacture or arrange for someone. You can only watch someone find it themselves. You can only make sure you're standing somewhere useful when they do. Carter Ridge Ranch did become known, in time, as something particular in the territory. Not the largest, not the oldest, not the most storied, but the one that had a certain reputation for how it ran and who ran it and what that meant for the people who worked there. The woman who'd been nobody's first choice had turned out to be the kind of person who changed the nature of a place simply by being fully present in it. And that was a kind of alchemy that no amount of wealth or land or social position could have manufactured or replaced. Ethan knew it. He had known it since a cold morning in a Harlan Creek pasture, when a woman who'd been awake since midnight caring for a sick heifer told him matter-of-factly who else was going to do it. And the answer in that statement was the whole of her character, available in one sentence if you knew how to look. He knew how to look. He had always known. He just needed, it turned out, to be somewhere nobody knew his name before he could remember that. And Abigail Miller Carter, who had spent the first 28 years of her life being treated as the person everyone looked past, had become, without trying to become it, without performing it, simply by insisting on her own presence in her own life, the person nobody who knew her could imagine looking past. That was not a fairy tale. It was better than a fairy tale. It was the true shape of what happens when a person refuses, at the final moment, to disappear, and what becomes possible in the long, complicated years that follow that refusal. The rest was just living, which is hard and imperfect and sometimes very good, and always, if you're doing it honestly, enough.